The moment Edna Fairchild walked through the door of the Millhaven Land Registry office with dried creek mud on her boots and black earth packed under every fingernail, every man in that room decided she was lying before she had even opened her mouth. It was the spring of 1882, and the Kansas plains were burning gold with early wheat. The sky stretched wide and merciless as it always was out on the frontier. Millhaven was a town that had been clawing at respectability for 6 years, long enough to have a proper courthouse, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a land registry run by a man named Gerald Potts, who wore starched collars even in the August heat, and who believed that property and dignity were inseparable qualities. Women who arrived alone and dusty, clutching documents in hands that had clearly been doing hard labor, did not fit comfortably into Gerald Potts's understanding of legitimate land ownership. Edna was 26 years old. She had traveled 3 days on a rented horse from the eastern edge of Comanche County, sleeping rough because she could not afford a boarding house, eating from a tin she kept in her saddlebag. She had her father's deed folded inside her coat, pressed against her ribs where she could feel the paper crinkle every time she breathed. Her hair was pinned up in the practical way of a woman who did not spend time in front of mirrors, and her dress was a deep indigo blue that had faded from too many washings, but had been her best one before the journey began. She had not come to Millhaven to be believed easily. She had come because she had no other choice. Gerald Potts looked up from his desk and blinked at her the way a man blinks at something unexpected and unwelcome. "Office hours are posted on the door," he said, as though she had done something wrong by arriving during them. "I can read," Edna said, and stepped fully inside. There were 2 other men in the room. One was a junior clerk named Alton who was barely 17 and had the unfortunate habit of laughing at whatever the senior men laughed at. The other was a heavy-set cattle attorney named Harlan Voss, who worked for the Bridle Creek Land and Cattle Company, and who had been in the middle of some conversation with Potts when Edna entered. Harlan Voss looked at her with immediate, calculating interest that had nothing charitable in it. Edna laid the deed on the counter. "My name is Edna Fairchild," she said. "My father was Thomas Fairchild. He filed on 480 acres northeast of Soldier Creek in 1876 under the Homestead Act. He worked that land for 6 years and earned full title. He died in February of this year, and the deed transfers to me as his only living heir. I am here to register the transfer and confirm my claim." Potts looked at the document without touching it. He looked at her hands. "You've been digging," he said. "I've been farming," she said. "A woman alone on 480 acres. He said it the way someone says a sentence that is meant to be its own argument. "A woman, alone, on 480 acres, she agreed, with a quiet and exact mimicry of his tone that made the clerk Alton look at the floor. It was at this precise moment that the door opened behind her. Seth Keller had been coming to the land registry for an entirely different reason. He was 31 years old and had been trying for 2 weeks to sort out a survey dispute on the southern boundary of his own claim, a frustration that had required him to ride into town on 3 separate occasions because Potts kept losing the relevant paperwork. He had grown up in eastern Missouri, come west at 22, and had spent 9 years building something out of dry ground and stubbornness. He ran cattle on 200 acres, grew a kitchen garden that was more practical than pretty, and had a reputation in Millhaven as a man who was fair and not easily irritated, which was a more valuable reputation on the frontier than most people understood. He stepped through the door, took in the scene in about 3 seconds, and stopped. He saw the deed on the counter. He saw Potts's face, which wore the particular expression of a man preparing a bureaucratic dismissal. He saw the back of a woman standing very straight, with travel dust still on her shoulders and her hands flat on the counter, in a way that suggested she had put them there deliberately so they would not shake. "My father filed legally," Edna was saying, her voice still controlled, but Seth could hear the effort in it. The deed is witnessed and recorded. I have the original filing receipt and the patent certificate. I know exactly what these documents are, and I know what they mean." "Miss Fairchild," Potts began, with the particular brand of patience that is actually condescension wearing a polite mask, "a deed of this nature, with a transfer claim of this size, requires verification of—" "I believe her," Seth said. The room went quiet. Potts looked up. Harlan Voss turned slowly from his position by the window. Alton the clerk forgot to look at the floor and looked at Seth instead. Edna turned around. Seth had not meant to say it quite so plainly. He had not meant to interrupt at all. But something about the way Potts had been building toward a dismissal, the practiced, well-oiled machinery of a man who had probably turned away a dozen inconvenient claims with the same smooth condescension, had struck him wrong. And something about the way this woman was standing, like she had been standing that way for a long time against things that pushed back hard, made the words come out before his better judgment had time to organize them. "She's got a deed," Seth said, crossing the room and standing beside her at the counter. He looked at the document properly. The paper was worn from handling, but the script was clear. The land office seal was intact, and the signatures were legible. "Soldier Creek Parcel, Northeast Section." "This is a proper homestead patent. You can see the general land office seal right there." Potts stiffened. "Mr. Keller, this is not your—" "She said her name is Edna Fairchild," Seth said calmly. "Thomas Fairchild filed this claim in 1876. I remember when he came through. Quiet man, worked his own fence lines. He died in February," she said. "If this deed is in order, and it looks like it's in order, then the transfer to his heir is a legal matter, not a matter of whether she arrived here looking like she just came off a working farm." He paused. "Did you want to check the registry for the original filing, or are you going to stand there and let her explain herself again?" There was a silence that had considerable weight in it. Edna was looking at him. He glanced at her just briefly and found her expression doing something complicated. She had brown eyes that were sharper and more tired than they should have been at her age, and there was a line between her brows that suggested she had spent a great deal of time recently trying to hold herself together. She had not expected this. He could see that clearly. She had walked in here prepared to fight every inch alone, and someone had simply stepped up beside her before she had finished making her case. "Mr. Keller," she said in a careful and slightly bewildered tone, "I appreciate it, but I was managing." "I know you were," he said honestly. "I just wanted to speed it along." Something shifted in her face. Not quite softening, more like a careful person noticing that the ground in an unexpected place is solid. Potts, under the combined pressure of a legitimately documented deed and a well-regarded local witness, retrieved the original registry ledger with considerable reluctance. Thomas Fairchild's filing was there in black ink, dated May 14, 1876. The acreage, the parcel description, the witness signatures, all of it matched. Potts spent 20 minutes trying to find a procedural technicality and did not find one, though he looked hard. Harlan Voss, who had not spoken during any of this, watched the whole proceeding with his arms folded and an expression Seth did not like. When the registration was finally stamped and Edna was handed her receipt, Voss gathered his hat from the hook by the door. "Congratulations, Miss Fairchild," he said, with a smile that was wider than it needed to be. "The land out by Soldier Creek is beautiful country. Be a shame if it turned out to be more than one woman could manage." He left before she could respond. Edna stared at the closed door for a moment. "Do you know him?" Seth asked her, keeping his voice low. "I know the Bridle Creek Company," she said, and her voice had gone flat in the way that voices go flat when they are covering something. "They sent a man to talk to my father 8 months before he died, offered him money for the land. My father said no." Seth watched her fold the stamped receipt carefully and tuck it inside her coat, over the original deed, pressing both against her ribs. He understood the gesture. Some things you keep close to your body because there is nowhere else safe. "Where are you staying?" he asked. She looked at him with an expression that said the question was more complicated than it sounded. "I came to file the deed," she said carefully. "I didn't plan much past that. There's a decent boarding house on Elm Street," he said. "Mrs. Colton runs it. She's fair-priced and she doesn't ask too many questions." "I'm not sure I have enough for a room tonight," Edna said, and the admission seemed to cost her something. She was not a woman who said that kind of thing easily. Seth considered for exactly 2 seconds. "I have a spread about 4 miles out," he said. "There's a separate outbuilding I converted to a proper room when my sister stayed last fall. You're welcome to it for tonight. No obligation." He added that last part because he could see the careful assessment happening behind her eyes. "You've had a long ride and you've just fought a bureaucratic war. You should sleep in a real bed." She looked at him for a long moment. "You believed me before I finished speaking," she said. "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because the way you were standing at that counter wasn't the way someone stands when they're telling a lie," he said. "And because the deed looked real, and because Potts was being a fool," he shrugged. All 3 things at once. Something quiet and uncertain crossed her face, and then she nodded. "Edna Fairchild," she said, and extended her hand the way a person extends their hand when they are accustomed to conducting their own business. "Seth Keller," he said, and shook it. Her grip was firm and her hand was exactly as calloused as he had expected. They rode out of Millhaven side by side in the late afternoon light, the town shrinking behind them and the prairie opening up the way it always did, enormously and without apology. The sky was the particular vivid orange of a Kansas spring evening, and the grass was green enough to look almost implausible. Seth showed her where the creek ran and where the grass grew thickest, and pointed out the ridge in the distance that marked the northeastern edge of Soldier Creek territory. "That's your land, more or less," he said. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "He worked it for 6 years. I thought I understood what that meant, but looking at it from here," she stopped. Seth did not push her. Some things needed the space of silence to be properly said. "He wrote me every month," she said after a while. "I was in Abilene working at a dry goods store. He kept saying, 'Come when you're ready, there's no rush.' And I kept thinking I would come when I had saved enough that I wouldn't be a burden." She paused. "He died before I was ready." "He left you 480 acres, Seth said quietly. "That's not leaving you with nothing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." His property was modest and well-tended, which told her things about him before he said a word about himself. The main house was solid timber and adobe, the kind of building that had been added to incrementally as resources allowed rather than planned all at once. There was a kitchen garden off the east side, exactly as practical as it was large, planted already with beans and squash, and a long row of what looked like winter onions. The corral held 4 horses and a mule, and the fence lines were straight and recently mended. He showed her to the outbuilding, which was small but clean, with a proper bed and a washstand with a good mirror, and a window that faced east so the morning light came in early. He left her a clean towel and a bar of soap without being asked, and said supper would be in an hour if she was hungry. She washed her hands twice. The dirt came out slowly, from under her nails and from the creases of her knuckles, and she stood at the basin watching the water go brown and thought about her father's hands, and how they had always been the same way, permanently worked into the soil, and how she had not thought of it as a hardship when she was a child but as proof of something. She went to supper. He cooked beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was as honest a meal as the frontier produced, and he did not make conversation she had to strain for. He asked about Abilene, and she told him about the dry goods store and the woman she had boarded with there, an older widow named Mrs. Prentice who had been sharp as a tack and unexpectedly kind. And he told her about coming west from Missouri and the first winter on his claim, which had been genuinely brutal in a way that sounded less like complaint and more like a fair accounting of events. They were careful with each other in the way 2 people are careful when they are both privately aware that something is happening between them, and neither one has decided what to do about it yet. She slept better than she had in weeks, in the small east-facing room with the window cracked and the prairie smell coming in, which was wild grass and turned earth, and the faint mineral scent of a creek somewhere nearby. In the morning she found him already at the kitchen table with coffee made, and he had a map of the Soldier Creek parcel spread out that he had apparently drawn from memory and then corrected with a pencil. "I know the northeast section fairly well," he said when she sat down. "Your father's boundary runs along the second ridge there, and there's a natural water source in the northeast corner that doesn't go dry even in August. That's valuable." He looked up. "I also think you should know that Harlan Voss and the Bridle Creek Company have been acquiring parcels along this whole stretch for 2 years. They've been mostly going after homesteaders who are struggling or recently widowed. Your father was not the first person they approached." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "What happened to the others?" "Some sold, a couple held on. One man had his fence lines cut and his water diverted, and he couldn't prove it was Bridle Creek, but everyone understood it was. He said it steadily, not trying to frighten her, just giving her the information she needed. 'I want you to know what you're walking into.' 'I already know,' she said. More or less. She looked at the map. 'But I didn't ride 3 days and spend my last money on a registration fee to go back to Abilene and work a counter.'" He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that she was beginning to recognize, a kind of quiet attention that was not intrusive but was very much present, the way a person looks when they are actually listening and not just waiting for their turn to speak. "Good," he said. "Then let's talk about what you'll need." They spent an hour over the map and the coffee. He told her what he knew about the soil conditions in the Soldier Creek area, the challenges of the northeast ridge where the ground went rocky, the best places to run a fence. She asked specific and intelligent questions that made clear she had been reading her father's letters carefully and had more practical knowledge than her years in a dry goods store might have suggested. She had grown up on a farm in Illinois before her family lost it, she explained, so the work was not strange to her. The loneliness might be. "It gets easier," Seth said. "The loneliness. It doesn't go away, but it becomes familiar, and familiar is manageable." "You speak from experience," she said. 9 years of it," he said. There was a pause in which the morning light came through the window and the coffee cooled slightly, and neither of them looked away from the other. "I should get out there today," she said. "I need to see the condition of the house. My father wrote that he had built a proper structure, but the last letter was 6 months before he died." "I'll ride out with you," Seth said, and when she started to object, he raised one hand slightly. "Not to manage things, just to see if there's anything that needs immediate attention, 2 sets of eyes." She considered him. "You have your own work," she said. "I do," he agreed. "I'll go back to it after." The Fairchild homestead at Soldier Creek was 4 miles northeast of Seth's claim, and the road between them was a good one, clear and dry, and running through open grassland that was coming up vivid green from the spring rains. They rode side by side, and Edna was quiet most of the way, watching the land with an expression Seth was coming to understand as her version of concentration. She was not a woman who talked constantly, which he found comfortable rather than awkward. What they found at the homestead was both better and worse than expected. Thomas Fairchild had indeed built a solid house, one main room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace, and a separate kitchen lean-to that was practical and well-designed. The roof was intact and the walls were sound. But the kitchen garden had gone wild over the winter and spring. The fence on the east side had 3 sections that needed replacing, and the small barn had a beam that had cracked and left the northwest corner of the roof sagging. Edna walked through the main room slowly. There were her father's things still on the shelves: a Bible, some tools, a tin mug, a pair of reading glasses that she picked up and held for a moment before setting carefully back down. Seth stood in the doorway and did not go further inside. This was her space and her grief, and he understood the difference between being supportive and being intrusive. She came back outside with her face composed and her spine straight. "The barn beam needs fixing first," she said, "or the roof goes. Then the east fence." She looked at the garden. "The garden is recoverable. A lot of what's growing in there is just my father's herbs gone to seed." She paused. "The house is good. He built it right." He did, Seth agreed. He was a careful man. She looked at him. Did you know him well? Not well. Enough to share a drink at the saloon a few times and talk about fence lines. He mentioned you. Said his daughter was in Abilene and was going to come west eventually when she was ready. He paused. He sounded proud of you. Edna looked away toward the ridge where the grass was long and the wind was moving through it in slow waves. I should have come sooner, she said. You're here now, Seth said, and the simplicity of it seemed to land on her in a particular way, not as consolation but as fact, which was what she needed. They worked side by side for 4 hours. Seth helped prop and brace the barn beam with materials he found in the barn itself. A proper repair would take better timber, but this would hold for now. Edna attacked the kitchen garden with a determination that was impressive and exhausting to watch, pulling the volunteer growth and the winter-killed stalks, and reassessing what her father had planted that might still be worth cultivating. They barely spoke while they worked, which was its own comfortable language. In the early afternoon, Seth rode back to his own claim, because he had cattle that needed attending to and a survey dispute that still needed resolving, and he had told her the truth when he said he would go back to his own work after. But before he left, he told her that he would check on the east fence in a day or two if she had not fixed it already, and she thanked him with the particular directness of a woman who does not offer thanks she does not mean. He thought about her the whole ride home, which was unusual for him. He was not a man given to distraction. But there was something in the way she had stood at that counter in the land registry, holding her ground with a quiet ferocity that was neither aggressive nor defeated, that had stayed with him the way images stay sometimes when they contain something you have not seen before. He told himself it was neighborly concern and did not entirely believe it. Edna spent her first night alone at the homestead, lying awake in her father's sleeping loft, listening to the prairie dark. There were coyotes somewhere to the north, a distant chorus, and the wind moved the grass constantly, a sound that was neither threatening nor entirely comforting but simply present. She had the deed and the registration receipt folded under her pillow. She was not sure if it was sentiment or practicality, perhaps both. She thought about Seth Keller with the careful deliberateness of a woman who is making a conscious choice to think about something instead of letting it think about itself. He was tall and square-shouldered with a face that had been genuinely weathered by 9 years on the frontier, not in a way that aged him beyond his years, but in a way that said he had been present for his own life. He had brown hair that needed cutting and steady gray eyes and hands that were as worked as hers, which she had noticed because she noticed those things. More than his appearance, she thought about the moment he had said, "I believe her," before she had finished her argument. She had been preparing for a long fight, had been marshaling her evidence and her composure in equal measure, and then this man she had never met had simply stepped up beside her and said it plainly, without theater, without expecting gratitude, without even, it seemed, fully thinking about whether it was strategically wise. He had just said what he thought was true. She could not remember the last time someone had done that for her. She stayed awake a long time, and when she finally slept she dreamed of green grass and a fence line that needed mending, which was, in its way, a hopeful dream. The next 3 weeks were some of the hardest and most productive of Edna's life. She rose before the sun and worked until her hands were shaking. She replanted the kitchen garden, fixed 2 of the 3 east fence sections herself with wire and posts she found in the barn, bartered work at Mrs. Colton's boarding house for extra flour and seed, and established a tentative but functional routine that made the homestead feel less like something she had inherited and more like something she was building. Seth came by on the 4th day, as he had said he might, to help with the 3rd fence section. They worked the whole morning on it, and he showed her a technique for stretching wire that his neighbor back in Missouri had taught him, and she was a quick study who was not embarrassed to ask the same question twice if the answer had not fully settled in her hands yet. By midday the fence was solid, and they sat on the rail eating cornbread she had made that morning, And the conversation went from fence repair to Missouri, to the particular stubbornness of prairie soil in dry years, to the question of whether she should try winter wheat or rye this fall. It was the kind of conversation that is, quietly and without announcing itself, the beginning of something. He came back 3 days after that, not with an excuse this time, just to see how things were going. She was on the roof of the barn when he arrived, assessing the cracked beam from above, and he looked up at her and she looked down at him, and there was a moment in which neither of them said anything, and the spring wind moved between them and the light was good. "I brought the timber for the beam," he said. "Had extra from a delivery." "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She climbed down, and they fixed the beam, and then they had coffee in her kitchen, which she had reorganized from her father's arrangement into her own, and he noticed the rearrangement and did not comment on it, which she appreciated more than she could explain. These visits happened every few days, and then every other day, and then simply regularly, without either of them formally deciding they were regular. He brought things, not gifts exactly, more the kind of practical provisions that flow between people who are neighbors in a genuine sense: extra wire, seed he had gotten a good price on, once a bag of books he had collected from a departing homesteader who was heading back east and could not carry them. She received these things the way she received his help, with direct thanks and without making them more or less than they were. But there were moments accumulating that were clearly something more. The evening he stayed for supper, and they talked until the dark had fully settled and the fire had burned low, and she said something about her mother, who had died when Edna was 11, something she rarely said to anyone, and he listened with that quality of attention she was coming to depend on without meaning to. The afternoon she came to his claim, because one of her horses had a leg that worried her, and he looked at it and said it was fine but she should soak it. And his hand and hers both rested on the horse's flank for a moment, and the moment went on slightly longer than it needed to, and neither of them moved away from it immediately. The morning she brought him cornbread, and he was already at his kitchen table with coffee, ready as though he had been expecting her, which he had been, and they both knew it, and they both did not say it. Harlan Voss came to the Fairchild homestead on a Thursday morning in late April, when Edna was in the kitchen garden on her knees in the soil. He came with 2 other men she did not recognize, both of them clearly hired for their size and presence rather than for any land negotiation expertise, and he stepped over her fence without opening the gate, which she noted. "Miss Fairchild," he said, in the warm voice of a man who is used to being underestimated when he smiles. "I hope you're finding yourself comfortable out here." Edna got to her feet and brushed the dirt from her knees without hurrying. "Mr. Voss," she said, "what can I do for you?" "Well, I was hoping we could talk about the land," he said. "I represent the Bridle Creek Land and Cattle Company, as I believe you know. We've made offers on several properties in this area, very fair offers, and I wonder if you might be interested in discussing." "No," she said. His smile didn't change. "You haven't heard the number yet." "I don't need to," she said. "The land is not for sale. My father worked it for 6 years and earned the patent and left it to me. I'm not selling it to a company that has been systematically buying up this valley to consolidate their grazing range." The smile finally did something less comfortable. "That's a strong characterization," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said. One of the large hired men shifted his weight. Edna did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Voss. "Miss Fairchild," Voss said, and his voice had dropped into a different register, quieter, which was somehow less pleasant than the warm one. "This is a lot of land for one woman alone. There are things that can go wrong out here. Fences come down. Water gets redirected. These things happen, and they're very hard to prove." "They are," she said evenly. "But they're also very easy to describe to a county sheriff and a land court, with documentation and witnesses." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her at the house, at the garden, at the land that stretched north and east. "Think about it," he said, and put his hat back on and turned and stepped back over her fence. She waited until the sound of their horses had faded before she let herself breathe the way she actually needed to breathe, which was with slightly more difficulty than usual. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. She rode to Seth's claim that afternoon. He was at the corral when she arrived, and she watched his face change as he read her expression, not to alarm but to a particular steadiness, the kind that is offered specifically because it is needed. She told him what Voss had said, word for word, as best she remembered it. Seth listened to all of it before he said anything. When he spoke, it was with the careful deliberateness of someone who is choosing not to let anger cloud the practical. "He threatened your water and your fences," he said. "He implied it," she said, without saying it plainly enough to quote. "That's how Bridle Creek operates," he said. "They did the same to a man named Henderson 18 months ago northeast of town. His water source had rocks dumped in it twice. He sold. He was quiet for a moment. You need to document everything. Every fence section, every water source, the condition of all of it, right now, before anything happens. Witnesses who can testify to what it looked like before." "I know," she said. "I can be one of those witnesses," he said. "And there are 2 other homesteaders along the creek, the Murtaugh family and a man named Boway who came up from the Santa Fe corridor, who have both had trouble with Bridle Creek inquiries. You should talk to them. A collective record is harder to dismiss than one person's account." She was looking at him with that expression she sometimes had, the one where she was paying attention to more than the words. "You know a lot about this," she said. "I've been watching it for a year and a half," he said, waiting to see which direction it went. He paused. "I'm glad you're not selling." The way he said it was honest and simple and carried more weight than the words themselves. "I'm not selling," she said firmly. And then, with a small shift in tone that was careful and almost careful enough to hide what it was, "Thank you, Seth, for today and for all of it." He looked at her. The afternoon light was slanted and warm, and the prairie beyond the corral fence was vivid with new grass. "Edna," he said, and then stopped, as though deciding something, as though weighing whether the moment was the right one or whether he was about to make something awkward that had been comfortable. He decided, apparently, that the moment was the right one. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If you're willing, I'd like to come calling and take you to supper in town and do this the right way." He paused. "I know you've got enough to worry about without—" "Yes," she said before he finished. He blinked. "Yes," she said again, and there was something in her face that she was not quite hiding, something warm and a little unsteady, like a lamp being lit in a room that has been dark for a while. "I'd like that." A slow smile crossed his face, not the quick reflexive kind but the other kind, the kind that takes its time and means it. "Saturday evening," he said. "I'll ride by at 6. "I'll be ready," she said. She rode home through the last of the afternoon light, and the prairie felt different. Not larger or smaller, but present in a new way, attending to something. Over the following weeks, the courtship unfolded with the particular pace of 2 adults who had learned to be careful about things that mattered. Seth came on Saturday evening, and they had supper at Millhaven's one respectable restaurant, a place called Hargreaves that served beef stew and fresh bread, and had a proprietor who knew Seth well enough to give them a table in the corner where the conversation was private. They talked for 2 hours, and the food went cold in a way that neither of them minded. He told her about his family in Missouri, a father who had been a blacksmith and a mother who read voraciously and had filled the house with books, 2 brothers who were still back east and who he wrote to rarely and felt guilty about. She told him about Illinois and the farm and her father leaving for Kansas when she was 18, the particular grief of watching your childhood home dissolve under debt and drought, the way she had set about making herself useful as a survival strategy, and then had simply continued, because it had become who she was. They walked back through Millhaven afterward, and the town was quiet in the early evening, the saloons just warming up and the families already gone inside, and the sky was doing the elaborate purple and orange thing that Kansas skies did in spring, that never really got ordinary no matter how many times you saw it. He walked her to her horse, and there was a moment at the hitching post where they stood close enough that she could see the particular quality of his eyes in the fading light, the steadiness in them that she had noticed from the beginning. "I enjoyed this evening," he said. "So did I," she said, and meant it completely. He took her hand and turned it over and looked at her palm for a moment, at the calluses and the healed blisters and the evidence of the work she had been doing, and then he lifted it and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles and looked up at her. She did not speak for a moment. She was deciding something. Then she said, "Saturday next," and the smile that came back at her was the slow kind again, the one that meant it. Through May and into early June the courtship deepened steadily. He came on Saturdays and sometimes midweek as well, and she came to his claim often enough that she learned the names of his horses and the particular rhythm of his days. They worked alongside each other regularly, on both properties, and this was not incidental to the romance but central to it, because they were both people who understood themselves through work, and the way someone worked alongside you told you things that conversation could only approximate. She learned that he was the kind of man who, when something frustrated him, went very quiet and then spent the frustration on the physical task at hand rather than on the people around him. She learned that he had a bone-dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly and was funnier for being unexpected. She learned that he read widely and remembered what he read, and that he was not embarrassed by this, which was not universal in frontier men. She learned that he had been briefly engaged 7 years ago to a woman who had come west with her family, and then gone back east when the first winter proved too hard, and that he did not speak about it with bitterness, only with the measured understanding of a man who has made peace with a thing. He learned that she was formidably competent in a way she tried not to advertise, not out of false modesty, but out of long experience with men who found it uncomfortable. He learned that she was not naturally easy in the presence of people she did not know, that what looked like composure was often effort, and that once she relaxed the effort, her actual personality was warmer and more directly funny than the composed version suggested. He learned that she sang to herself when she was working, not loud and not self-consciously, just as part of thinking, fragments of hymns and songs from Illinois. He learned that she cried exactly once in his presence. On the evening she finished her father's Bible and found his handwriting in the margins, and that she did not apologize for it, only sat with it for a few minutes and then got up and made coffee. He loved her before either of them said the word out loud. The trouble from Bridle Creek came in mid-June, and it came in the form Voss had implied it would. Edna went to check on her northeast water source one morning and found it partially blocked, not by natural debris but by rocks and a section of old fencing that had been deliberately placed. It had not fully stopped the water, but it had reduced the flow significantly, and if it were left, would begin to affect her summer planting. She photographed it in her mind with the exactness of a woman who had been told to document everything, and then she rode directly to Seth's claim, and then they rode together to the Murtaugh farm and to Bow Way's property, both of whom came immediately when the situation was explained. Bow Way had been farming his claim for 3 years. He was a patient and careful man who had come north from New Mexico territory and who had faced more than his share of difficulty from neighbors who resented his presence, beyond just the Bridle Creek issue. He kept meticulous records of everything, which was both a practical habit and a form of self-preservation. He examined the blockage, noted the type of rock and the fence material, and identified the fence section as matching material he had seen near a Bridle Creek property 2 miles north. This was not proof, but it was the kind of detail that mattered in a county court. Patrick Murtaugh, who ran cattle with his wife Clara on 200 acres to the west, was less systematic and more vocally furious, which Edna found both less useful and privately somewhat satisfying. Clara Murtaugh, who was a compact and practical woman from County Cork, was useful in the way that mattered. She had witnessed Bridle Creek riders on the North Road 2 days prior and could say so in front of a judge. They cleared the blockage that morning, all of them together, and Seth rode into Millhaven that afternoon to speak with the county sheriff, a man named Jim Burrell, who was not corrupt, but who was cautious in the way that officials become cautious when they are dealing with companies that have substantial legal resources. Seth presented the documentation calmly and specifically, and Jim Burrell listened and said he would look into it and wrote everything down, which was the most they could realistically expect. That evening, Edna sat on her porch in the last of the light and Seth sat beside her, and neither of them spoke for a while. "It's not going to stop," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "Not until they give up or we make it costly enough to pursue a different strategy. Or until we take it to court," she said, "which I cannot afford alone. The Murtaghs and Bowway might go in with you," he said. "A collective suit is harder to throw out and splits the cost." "And you," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not directly affected by Bridal Creek," he said. "Not yet, my parcel is just far enough south." "But you'd come to court," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'd come to court," he said, "as a witness and as anything else you need." She looked at him in the evening light, and what she felt was something specific and clear, not the tentative awareness of earlier weeks but the full, landed certainty of it, the way you know a beam is sound when you put your weight on it and it holds. "Seth," she said. He looked at her. "I think I love you," she said. "I want you to know that it's not because you believed me in that land registry or because you've helped me with every practical problem I've had since I arrived. Those things matter, but they're not the reason." She paused, arranging the words with care. "The reason is the way you listen. The reason is that you've never once looked at me like my competence was a problem or my difficulty was a burden. The reason is that I know you now and I like who you are." He had been very still while she spoke. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment, and she knew his silences by now well enough to know this one was not absence but fullness. "I've been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the third time you came to check on your own property and came back with a better plan than you'd arrived with." He paused, which is maybe a strange thing to say. "It's not strange," she said. "I love you, Edna," he said simply. "I have for a while." She reached out and took his hand, and they sat on the porch of her father's house in the prairie dark with the coyotes distant and the grass moving in the night wind, and it was the most settled Edna had felt in longer than she could properly say. He kissed her for the first time on the walk back to the corral where his horse was tied, a slow and certain kiss with his hand against her face and the stars enormous overhead, and the prairie dark around them felt less like loneliness and more like privacy. She stood at the corral fence watching him ride out and thought that the word she had used, love, had felt right in her mouth, exact and real, which was not something she had expected. The month of July brought heat and the Bridal Creek situation to a simultaneous boil. Edna, the Murtaghs, and Bowway formally filed a complaint with the county court in late June, citing documented interference with water rights and property, with Seth and Clara Murtagh as witnesses. Harlan Voss retained a lawyer from Wichita, which suggested that Bridal Creek took the complaint seriously enough to worry about it. The hearing was set for August. Meanwhile, the summer work was relentless. Edna's wheat was coming up well, the northeast section that Seth had said would be her best land proving him right, and the kitchen garden was producing more than she could eat alone. She brought vegetables to the Murtaghs and to Bowway, and in late July began selling the surplus at the Millhaven market, which was a small weekly affair but a real one, and which brought her into better standing in the town than she had started with. She and Seth spent more evenings than not together, sometimes at her place, sometimes at his. They cooked together, which was a kind of intimacy that Edna had not anticipated and which turned out to be very much its own language, who took which task without being asked, how they moved around each other in the kitchen without collision, the way he tasted things and looked at her when they were good, and the way she laughed when something didn't work, which was easy and unguarded in a way her laughs in public were not. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in late July, on the porch of his own house this time, with the sky doing its elaborate work and the summer air warm and full of the smell of grass and dry earth and the faint, distant coolness of the creek. He had not prepared a speech, which was in keeping with him, but what he said was thorough and honest. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to help you build what you're building at Soldier Creek, and I want you to help me with what I'm building here, and I want us to figure out what we're building together, which I think might be more than either one separately. I want to come home to you, and I want you to come home to me." He paused. "And I want to be on your side in court in August, which I already am, but I'd like to be on it in a more permanent sense." She laughed, which was the full, easy laugh, and then she said yes with the same directness she had said yes to his courtship proposal, the directness of a woman who knows her own mind and does not waste time on performance. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a narrow gold band with a small garnet, which he had been carrying in his coat pocket for 2 weeks in the specific hope of this moment. He put it on her finger, and she looked at it, and then at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that she did not look away from. They were married in October in the Millhaven church that doubled as a schoolhouse by the pastor Reverend Graves, who was a mild man with excellent judgment about when to be brief. The Murtags were there, Patrick and Clara both, with their 3 children who sat in a row of descending height and fidgeted uniformly. Bao Wei was there, sitting in the second pew with the same patient seriousness he brought to everything, and he had brought chrysanthemums from his garden, which he handed to Edna at the door and which she carried through the ceremony. Mrs. Colton from the boarding house was there, and the dry goods store owner and his wife, and a scattering of other Millhaven people who had formed an opinion of Edna over the previous months, and had generally formed a favorable one, because she was straightforward and did not run up credit she could not pay and could fix her own fence. Edna wore the indigo blue dress, cleaned and pressed, with her hair properly pinned, and a length of cream ribbon that Clara Murdoch had contributed with characteristic pragmatic generosity. Seth wore his good suit, which was dark brown and fit him well, and he had gotten a haircut. When Reverend Graves pronounced them husband and wife and Seth turned to face her, what was in his expression was not complicated. It was simply everything he had said on the porch, present in his face all at once. She kissed him in front of the assembled Millhaven faithful and did not rush it. The courthouse hearing happened 5 days after the wedding, which was not ideal timing but could not be moved, and Edna stood before the judge as Edna Keller now, which she had decided was both legally pragmatic and personally pleasing, though she told Seth privately that she intended to keep Fairchild as a middle name, which was her father's, and she would not leave it behind. The hearing was 3 hours long, and the Bridal Creek lawyer from Wichita was good, smooth, and technical, and skilled at making documented evidence seem ambiguous. But Bao Wei's records were meticulous, and Clara Murdoch was not intimidated by smooth lawyers, and Seth's testimony about the conversation he had observed between Voss and Edna in the land registry, specifically the implied threat about fences and water, was delivered with a calm precision that the judge, a dry-spoken man named Clarence Howells who had been on the bench for 12 years, appeared to find credible. Judge Howells ruled in favor of the combined complaint. Bridal Creek was ordered to cease any interference with water rights along the Soldier Creek corridor, to pay a fine to the county, and was warned that a second complaint would carry significantly harsher consequences. Harlan Voss sat through the ruling with his hands flat on the table and his face doing nothing readable. They did not celebrate loudly that evening. They went home together to Seth's house, which had become their house, and Edna made coffee and Seth sat across from her at the kitchen table, and they were quiet for a while in the way of people who have gotten through something together and are sitting in the relief of it. "He'll leave the water alone now," Seth said. "Probably," Edna agreed, "for a while. The ruling is on record," he said. "That changes the calculation for them." "It does." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "My father would have appreciated that." "He would have," Seth said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. "I want to plant winter wheat on the northeast section," she said. Bao Wei says his rye has done well in that soil type, but I think the market's better for wheat right now. He looked at her with the particular expression he had when she was thinking in a way he found genuinely excellent. The Millhaven Mill is paying premium rates for wheat this season, he said. I read it in the county paper last week. Then wheat, she said. Wheat, he agreed. They sat together in the warm kitchen, and the prairie dark outside was just dark now, not lonely, and the lamp made a good light, and it was the beginning of the life they were building, ordinary and specific and entirely theirs. That first winter of their marriage was a testing one, because the frontier required it. December brought a cold snap that killed half of Edna's kitchen herb garden despite her precautions, and froze 2 water pipes in the Soldier Creek house, which they had kept for use as a second working property rather than selling or leaving empty. They lost a calf to the cold, and Seth spent 3 days in January mending fence in temperatures that were frankly unfriendly to the enterprise. But there were also evenings around the fire reading together, Seth with one of the books from the departed homesteader's collection, and Edna with her father's Bible and her own journal, in which she had begun keeping notes that were part weather record and part farm log and part, quietly, a correspondence with her own interior life. There were the particular pleasures of 2 people learning each other at close range, which was not without friction, but which was consistently worth the friction. He was more set in his routines than she had fully understood, and she was less patient with administrative tasks than she had presented herself. But these were the ordinary negotiations of 2 people sharing a life, and they conducted them mostly without spectacular drama. Bao Wei came to supper twice that winter, and the 3 of them talked about water rights and crop rotation, and the increasing migration of settlers from the eastern states, which was both encouraging and complicated in its implications for land prices and town growth. Clara Murtaugh came once, without Patrick, who was ill, and spent the evening talking with Edna about things that women on the frontier talked about when they were honest, which were the practical challenges of isolation and the question of children and the negotiation of self in a life that required extraordinary labor. Edna was pregnant by spring. She told Seth on a March morning when the first green was coming back into the grass, and the light was doing the particular hopeful thing it did at the tail end of the frontier winter. She told him straightforwardly, as she told him most things, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee cup in front of her. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked up from his coffee, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before, an unguarded openness, not different from his usual steadiness but wider, like a door that has been opened all the way. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm healthy and I'm capable of working, which I intend to do." "I know you are," he said, and the smile that followed was the slow kind. "I'm not worried about you. He stopped and tried again. "I'm very glad," he said, which was inadequate, and both of them knew it, but it was also exactly what he meant. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers in it. "Me too," she said. The spring planting went on as planned, because the land did not accommodate sentiment, and Edna worked through the first months of her pregnancy with the same determined efficiency she had applied to everything, though she was honest with herself and with Seth about when she was tired, which was a new honesty for her and required some practice. Seth was attentive without being managing, which was the exact calibration she needed, and she told him so, which he received with the dry humor that had become one of her favorite things about him. "I'm trying very hard not to ask if you should be doing that," he said, watching her move hay bales in the barn one afternoon. "I noticed," she said. "I appreciate it. It's costing me," he said. She laughed and set down the bale and straightened up. "Ask if you need to ask," she said. "Should you be moving hay bales?" he asked. "Probably not very large ones," she said. "These are fine, but thank you for asking." He nodded with the gravity of a man who has successfully completed a difficult diplomatic mission. Their son was born in November of 1883, On a cold, clear night when the stars were brilliant, and the wood stove was burning well, and Clara Murtaugh, who had delivered her own 3 children and had practical obstetric knowledge that far exceeded the nearest doctor's access, was there and capable and calm throughout the entire proceeding. Seth was allowed to sit in the kitchen and was not allowed in the other room during the birth itself, which was a standard arrangement, and which he accepted with poor grace and good behavior simultaneously. When Clara came out and said, "Come in," and he went in and saw Edna sitting up in the bed with a child wrapped in the blue flannel blanket they had prepared, his face did the unguarded thing again, the door open all the way thing, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them. "He's healthy," Clara said from the doorway. "Edna did beautifully. He came right at midnight." "A November midnight," Seth said, looking at his son's face, which was red and new and emphatically present. "He'll be a stubborn one," Clara said cheerfully, and went to put more water on. "His mother's qualities," Seth said. "His father's as well," Edna said, and looked at him. And what was between them in that moment was the kind of thing that is not adequately contained by any particular word, but that you spend a life building toward. They named him Thomas after her father. Thomas James Keller, James for Seth's father. They called him Tom almost immediately because that was the name that fit. And Tom was from the first days a particularly alert and determined infant who slept well and fed enthusiastically, and watched the world with large gray eyes that were unmistakably his father's. The Soldier Creek homestead became, in the following year, both a working farm and a property Seth managed alongside his own, with Edna making the decisions about what to plant and how to run it, and Seth contributing the additional labor and resources that made 2 properties manageable. They discussed this arrangement thoroughly and specifically, because Edna was not interested in allowing her property to become absorbed into Seth's in any practical or legal sense, and Seth had not suggested that it should be. It was hers, it remained hers. What they built together was a function of both, not a merger. In the spring of 1884, Bowway sold his claim, not to Bridle Creek, which had gone quiet after the court ruling, and the change in management that occurred when Harlan Voss left the company under unclear but unsurprising circumstances, but to a young couple coming from Texas who wanted to farm and were willing to pay a fair price. He went south to New Mexico, where he had family connections, and where the landscape, he said, reminded him of something he had needed to get back to. He came to supper the night before he left, and they sat around the table, the 4 of them with Tom asleep in his cradle by the fire, and talked about everything and nothing for several hours. When he left, he shook Seth's hand and then turned to Edna and took both of her hands in his and said, "Your father would have been very proud," and the words were so precisely what she needed and had not known she needed that she could not speak for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no life on the frontier was, but they were full in the way that matters. The land produced. The cattle on Seth's claim grew in number steadily, and he hired a hand named Rodriguez, a young man from a ranching family near Dodge City who was excellent with horses, and who became a reliable presence on the property over several years. Edna expanded the Soldier Creek wheat planting, and eventually added a modest orchard of apple trees in the northeast corner, near the water source that Bridle Creek had tried to block, which felt like a particular satisfaction every spring when the blossoms came in. Tom grew into a boy who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's directness, and an apparently bottomless capacity for getting muddy that exceeded both of them. He was followed in the summer of 1886 by a daughter they named Vera, who arrived in July with the heat, and who had from the first moment a temperament that suggested she was going to be interested in everything and apologetic about nothing. Tom was alternately fascinated and alarmed by her presence, which Clara Murtaugh said was exactly right and would serve him well later. Edna took Tom to the Soldier Creek homestead regularly from the time he was old enough to walk it without being carried, and she showed him the fence lines and the water source and the wheat fields and the orchard, and she told him about his grandfather Thomas Fairchild, who had worked this land for 6 years and earned it and left it for them. She told him about arriving in Millhaven with the deed and the dirt and the encounter in the land registry, which Tom, by the time he was 6, had heard enough times that he could complete certain sentences. He particularly liked the part where she said his father had said "I believe her" before she had finished speaking, which he found both romantic and heroic in the uncomplicated way that 6-year-olds find things. "Did you like him right away?" Tom asked once on a summer evening when they were sitting on the Soldier Creek porch together and Seth was inside making supper. Edna considered. "I thought he was good," she said carefully. "Right away. That's different from liking, but it's the beginning of it." Tom considered this with the gravity of a child taking notes on the world. "Because he told the truth," he said. "Because he told the truth," she said, "and he didn't need anything in return for it." Tom seemed satisfied with this, and they sat together in the summer evening, and the grass moved in the wind and the apple trees in the northeast corner were heavy with the small green fruits that would be ready in September, and the land was hers and theirs and real. In 1887, 5 years after Edna had walked into the Millhaven land registry with dirt under her nails and a deed in her coat, Gerald Potts retired and was replaced by a younger man who processed transfers with efficient neutrality, and who, on the afternoon, Edna came in to file the formal deed update reflecting the orchard addition and the improved water channel, looked at her documents and said, "Everything's in order, Mrs. Keller," and stamped them without event. She came out of the registry office into the Millhaven afternoon, which was warm and dusty and full of the sound of a growing town. More buildings now, a proper school separate from the church, 2 more stores, the sound of a hammer somewhere to the north where another house was going up. She stood on the boardwalk and looked at the town that had tried to dismiss her 5 years ago and thought about the distance between that morning and this one. Seth was waiting at the hitching post with both horses. He had come into town with her because he had survey business of his own, the original dispute that had brought him to the registry on the day they met, which had been finally and fully resolved 2 years prior, but which he still brought up occasionally with the fond exasperation of a man who has found the comedy in a frustration that is behind him. He read her expression. "All good," he said. "All stamped," she said, and held up the receipt. He smiled, the slow one, the one she had never gotten tired of. She crossed the boardwalk and stood beside him at the hitching post, and they were close enough that she could feel the warmth from his arm and smell the familiar combination of sun and work and the particular soap he used. "I was thinking," she said, "about the first time I stood at that counter in there." "I think about it too," he said. "You were not subtle," she said, "coming up beside me like that." "No," he agreed. "I wasn't. I had it in hand," she said. "You did," he said. "I just wanted to speed it along." This was the exchange they had had before, a variation of it, and it had the warm, worn quality of a thing that has been said enough times that it has become its own small ceremony. "Do you know what the strangest thing was?" she said. "What?" "I had prepared for every argument," she said. "I had prepared for Potts and for every possible objection. I had rehearsed. And then you said it just plainly like that before I was even finished, and all that preparation just—" She paused. "I didn't know what to do with someone who just believed me." He looked at her, the steady gray eyes in the afternoon light, 5 years and 2 children and 480 acres and 1 courthouse ruling between them and the people they had been that morning. "You deserve to be believed," he said. "That was obvious." "It wasn't obvious to everyone in that room," she said. "It was obvious to me," he said. She took his hand and held it, and the Millhaven street moved around them in the ordinary ways of a Thursday afternoon, horses and carts, and the sound of the school bell a few blocks over where Tom was currently sitting in his 2nd year of formal schooling and Vera would begin the following autumn. They rode home together through the Kansas afternoon, through the grassland that was late summer gold and the sky that was immense and blue and the familiar road between Millhaven and Soldier Creek, and then south to their house, which was the original house enlarged now by 2 rooms and a proper porch on the south side that Seth had built the previous fall. Tom was at the Murtaugh farm for the afternoon, a standing arrangement with the Murtaugh children that had become its own small institution, and Rodriguez had brought Vera home from there and was watching her in the kitchen garden with the patient vigilance of a young man who had discovered, to his own considerable surprise, that he had a talent for keeping small children from eating things they should not eat. Seth lifted Vera up when they came through the gate, and she grabbed his face in both small hands the way she always did, with a proprietorial enthusiasm that he always received with complete solemnity. "Good afternoon," he said, as though greeting an adult. "Papa," she said in the tone of a person reporting something important, "there are 17 beans." "In the garden," he said. "In my hand," she said, and opened one hand to show him several dried beans she had apparently collected from somewhere and been carrying in her fist. "Impressive," he said, with complete sincerity. Edna watched them from the gate and felt the thing that had no tidy name, the feeling of a life that is yours in every corner, that you built from a piece of paper and 3 days on a rented horse, and the prairie dirt under your fingernails, and the unexpected grace of one person who believed you before you finished speaking. They had supper as the sun went down, the 4 of them at the kitchen table, with the lamp lit and the wood stove warm, and Tom telling a complicated story about something that had happened at the Murtaugh farm involving a chicken and a misunderstanding that he evidently found much funnier in the retelling than the adults could fully follow, and Vera eating with the focused determination she brought to everything, and Seth across the table from her, in the lamplight, with his gray eyes and the slow smile that she had loved now for long enough that she could not clearly remember what the world had felt like before it. She caught his eye over Tom's ongoing narration, and he raised one eyebrow very slightly, the expression he used when one of the children was being particularly themselves, and she bit the inside of her cheek not to laugh. After supper, after the children were in bed in the 2 small rooms they had claimed with the absolute certainty of territorial children everywhere, she and Seth sat on the south porch in the dark. The stars were enormous in the way they only were far from town, and the grass was whispering in a light wind, and somewhere along Soldier Creek a frog was making a sound that had been making that sound every summer night for as long as the creek had been there. "Tom asked me again yesterday," Seth said, "whether he can have his own horse." "He asked me last week," Edna said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him he was 7, she said, and he pointed out quite logically that he would be 8 in November. Seth was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong," he said. "He's definitely not wrong," she said, "which is the problem with him." She could hear the smile in Seth's response without looking at him. "We'll see about the horse for his birthday," he said. "We will," she agreed. The dark was warm and full of small sounds, and the stars moved in their slow arc overhead, and Edna put her head against Seth's shoulder and felt the familiar solidity of him and thought about the distance, again, between that woman with the deed pressed against her ribs and a 3-day ride behind her and no plan past the moment. And this specific moment on this specific porch in this life. She had come to Millhaven to register a deed. She had come prepared to fight every inch alone, because alone had been her situation for a long time, and she had learned to inhabit it. And then this man had stepped up beside her and said 3 words before she had finished making her argument, and the alone had simply, gradually, and then all at once become something else entirely. "Seth," she said. He said. "I love you," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his hand moving to her hair, slow and certain the way everything he did was slow and certain. "I love you, Edna," he said. And then, after a moment, "Did I tell you about the Southwest Boundary Survey?" She laughed. "Not today. The new surveyor came out Thursday," he said. "Apparently Henderson's old line was off by 11 feet. 11 feet, she said. North, he said. Inconvenient, she said. Profoundly, he said. And they sat on the porch in the warm dark and talked about survey lines and the question of Tom's horse, and whether the apple trees would be ready for harvest in time. And it was ordinary, and it was theirs, and it was the whole world in the way that ordinary things, properly cultivated, become. The orchard at Soldier Creek produced its first full harvest in the autumn of 1888. Edna stood in the northeast corner of her father's land on a September morning with a basket on her arm and Tom beside her, and Vera on Seth's shoulders further down the row. The apples heavy on every branch, red and green in the morning light, and she thought about her father's hands in the margins of his Bible, and the 6 years he had worked this land before she arrived to carry it forward. She picked an apple and handed it to Tom, who ate it with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child eating something excellent, and the juice ran down his chin, and he said with his mouth full that it was the best thing he had ever eaten, which was something he said about many things but which still, every time, seemed exactly true. Seth came along the row with Vera still on his shoulders, and Vera was reaching for apples from her elevated position with the strategic opportunism she applied to everything, and he looked at Edna over the baskets and the autumn morning and the rows of trees she had planted in her father's land. "Good harvest," he said. "Very good," she agreed. And it was. It really was. The land was hers, and it was real, and the deed was properly registered in the Millhaven Land Office in the name of Edna Fairchild Keller, and the water ran clear in the northeast corner without obstruction, and the wheat came up every year in the good soil her father had first turned, and her children knew the names of the fields and the creek and the ridge, and the man she had married was standing in the apple orchard with their daughter on his shoulders and the September light on his face. And none of it was anything she had planned when she rode into Millhaven with 3 days of trail dust on her, and a deed nobody was prepared to believe was hers. All of it was everything.